It was a quiet morning in the bustling market of Umuaka, a small town in eastern Nigeria. The market women and men were setting up their stalls, arranging their goods as the sun crept slowly into the sky. Among the traders was a newcomer, an odd woman whose face no one had ever seen before. She had no family in the town, no friends, yet she had suddenly appeared with a small wooden stall at the far corner of the market. Before we continue the story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more enchanting tales like this one. Her name was Madame Ojugo, a short woman with a soft voice and a strange charm that made people feel uneasy around her. She sold meat so fresh and tender that it soon became the talk of the town. People marveled at how clean and well-cut her meat was, and the most astonishing thing was the price. Madame Ojugo sold her meat so cheaply that it was almost as if she was giving it away for free. People flocked to her stall, eager to buy from her. Some whispered among themselves, questioning how she could sell such fine cuts at such low prices. Others didn't care. They were just happy to buy the meat they could finally afford. Madame Ojugo smiled at each customer with a knowing grin, never saying much beyond the necessary words of trade. "Take care," she would say as they walked away, clutching their bags of meat tightly. Word spread quickly, and soon Madame Ojugo's stall was the busiest in the market. The other meat sellers grew jealous. They couldn't understand how she was making a profit, and worse, their own businesses were suffering because of her. One day, Obioma, the oldest meat seller in the market, decided to confront Madame Ojugo. He was a tall, burly man with years of experience in the trade. He had inherited his stall from his father and had never seen competition like this before. Obioma watched her carefully, waiting for the right moment to approach. As the market was closing one evening, Obioma walked over to her stall. He crossed his arms and cleared his throat, trying to appear friendly, though the frustration was evident in his eyes. "Madame Ojugo," he began, his deep voice echoing through the nearly empty market. "You've been here for some weeks now, and I must say your prices are unusual. How do you manage to sell such fine meat so cheaply?" Madame Ojugo looked up at him with her calm eyes. She wiped her hands on her apron, which was stained with blood from the day's work. "I have my ways," she replied cryptically. "But I assure you there is nothing to worry about." Obioma frowned. He had expected a better answer, something that would put his mind at ease. But this woman's words only deepened his suspicion. "People are talking," he continued, lowering his voice. "They say something isn't right about your meat." Madame Ojugo chuckled softly, a sound that sent chills down Obioma's spine. "People will always talk," she said. "But as long as they keep buying, does it really matter?" Obioma shook his head and turned to leave, feeling unsettled by her strange demeanor. He had a feeling there was more to Madame Ojugo than met the eye. But as the days passed, more and more people bought from her, and the whispers about her only grew louder. Soon, the town would learn the truth about Madame Ojugo, and it was a truth more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The people of Umuaka were happy for the most part. The town was peaceful, and the market was thriving thanks to Madame Ojugo's affordable meat. But then, something strange began to happen. People started to go missing. It began with the strangers, people passing through town who had no family to raise alarm when they disappeared. First, no one noticed or cared. After all, Umuaka was a small town, and strangers came and went without much attention. But then, the disappearances became more frequent. A woman selling vegetables, a local farmer, a schoolteacher. One by one, they vanished without a trace. At first, the town didn't make the connection. People assumed the missing individuals had simply left the town or met some misfortune on the road. But the more it happened, the more suspicious it became. Families began to worry. Friends exchanged uneasy glances at the market, wondering if they would be next. But no one could figure out what was happening, and the authorities had no leads. Meanwhile, Madame Ojugo's stall grew busier by the day. Despite the fear spreading through Umuoka, people still bought her meat. Her charm and the allure of her cheap prices seemed to overshadow the growing unease in the town. And then one day something changed. Ike, a young man who worked as an apprentice to Obioma, the old meat seller, disappeared. Ike was well known and well liked in Umuoka. His disappearance hit the town hard, and this time the people could not ignore it. Obioma was devastated. He had taken Ike under his wing when the boy was just 15, teaching him everything he knew about the meat trade. Now Ike was gone just like the others, and no one had any answers. The town was on edge, and the tension was palpable. People whispered behind closed doors, sharing their fears and suspicions. Some began to suspect that the disappearances were somehow connected to the market. After all, it was there that most of the missing people had last been seen. And so, the mystery deepened, and with each passing day, the people of Umuoka grew more afraid. Days passed, and Ike's disappearance weighed heavily on the town. The tension in Umuoka was thick, like a fog that refused to lift. Each morning, market vendors whispered to one another, casting furtive glances at Madame Ojugo's stall. Some started avoiding her altogether, while others, lured by the low prices, continued to buy her meat in secret. Obioma, however, was determined to find answers. He had known Ike since the boy was a child, and losing him like this felt like losing a son. The pain in his heart was sharp, but beneath it lay a burning desire for justice. He couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was at play, and he was certain that Madame Ojugo was involved. One evening, after the market had closed and the sun dipped below the horizon, Obioma made a decision. He would confront Madame Ojugo once and for all. If she had any involvement in Ike's disappearance, he would uncover it. Gathering his courage, he set off toward her stall, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The market was eerily quiet as Obioma approached Madame Ojugo's stall. She was still there, wiping down her counter as she always did at the end of the day. Her back was to him, but Obioma could feel her presence like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. "Madame Ojugo," Obioma called out, his voice firm. She turned slowly, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Ah, Obioma," she said softly, her lips curling into a faint smile. "What brings you here so late?" Obioma took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. He could feel the cold sweat forming on his brow, but he steadied himself. "I want to know the truth," he said, his voice unwavering. "Ike is missing, and I believe you know something about it." Madame Ojugo's smile didn't falter, but her eyes darkened ever so slightly. She tilted her head, studying him. "Why would you think that?" she asked, her voice smooth and calm, like silk sliding over stone. Obioma clenched his fists. "Too many people have gone missing in this town, and it all started after you arrived," he said. "Your meat is cheap, too cheap. And now my apprentice is gone. I demand to know what's going on." Madame Ojugo chuckled softly, a sound that made Obioma's skin crawl. "You're an observant man, Obioma," she said, stepping closer to him. "But you ask questions that you may not want answers to." Obioma swallowed hard, but he refused to back down. "Ike was like a son to me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I will not rest until I find him, or at least know what happened to him." Madame Ojugo's smile faded, and for the first time, Obioma saw something shift in her eyes, something dark and malevolent. She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're playing a dangerous game, old man," she said. "Some truths are best left buried." Obioma's heart raced in his chest, but he stood his ground. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, though the words felt hollow. Madame Ojugo straightened up, her expression cold. "Very well," she said. "If you want answers, come to my home tonight. But be warned, Obioma, once you enter, there is no turning back." Obioma hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to turn back now. "I'll be there," he said. Madame Ojugo watched him for a moment longer before turning back to her stall. "Good," she said, her tone almost playful. "I'll be waiting." As Obioma walked away, his heart pounded in his chest. He knew he was heading into dangerous territory, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was closer to the truth than ever before. Whatever secrets Madame Ojugo was hiding, he was determined to uncover them. Night fell over Umuoka like a heavy blanket, thick with the sounds of nocturnal creatures and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Obioma made his way through the narrow, winding paths that led to Madame Ojugo's home, clutching a small lantern in his hand. His steps were slow and deliberate, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. As he approached the outskirts of town, the houses became fewer, the trees thicker. The path narrowed until it was little more than a trail through the dense forest. Obioma's heart thumped loudly in his chest, but he pressed on, the soft glow of his lantern guiding him forward. At last, he arrived at a small, weathered house at the edge of the forest. It was a strange place, isolated with dark, gnarled trees encircling it like sentinels. The house looked as though it had been forgotten by time, with cracked windows and a roof that sagged under the weight of moss and decay. Obioma hesitated at the entrance, staring at the door for what felt like an eternity. A chill ran down his spine as he raised his hand to knock. Before his fist could make contact, the door creaked open slowly, revealing Madame Ojugo standing in the dim light of a single candle. "You came," she said, her voice soft but filled with an unsettling undertone. Obioma nodded, stepping cautiously into the house. The air inside was heavy, thick with an earthy smell that clung to his nostrils. The interior was as strange as the exterior, sparse and dark, with only the barest of furniture. A large wooden table sat in the center of the room, and on it, several old books and jars filled with what looked like dried herbs and strange powders. Madame Ojugo gestured for him to sit, and though every instinct told him to run, Obioma took a seat at the table. She sat across from him, her gaze unwavering. "Now you want answers," she said, her voice low and calm. Obioma nodded again, his throat dry. "Yes." Madame Ojugo leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "You're a brave man, Obioma," she said. "But bravery can be a double-edged sword." Obioma stiffened but didn't respond. He was waiting for her to continue. "Tell me," she said, her tone almost casual. "Do you believe in the old ways? The ways of the spirits?" Obioma frowned, unsure of what she meant. "What are you talking about?" Madame Ojugo's smile returned, but this time, it was filled with something far more sinister. "There are things in this world that you cannot comprehend, Obioma. Forces that walk among us, unseen by those who choose not to see. I have made a pact with such forces, and it is they who provide me with my meat." Obioma felt a chill run down his spine. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process her words. You use spirits to get your meat." Madame Ojugo chuckled softly. "Not exactly," she said. "I do not hunt animals for my meat, Obioma. The spirits provide me with something much more valuable. Obioma's blood ran cold as the realization dawned on him. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair over in the process. You've been using people?" His voice trembled with horror. Madame Ojugo didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, her eyes gleaming in the dim candlelight. "Yes," she said simply. "The spirits take the souls of the living, and in return they give me the flesh. It is a fair trade." Obioma backed away, his hands shaking. "You're a monster," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Madame Ojugo stood slowly, her movements deliberate and calculated. "Perhaps," she said. "But this is the price I pay for power. And now, Obioma, you know the truth." Obioma stumbled backward toward the door, his mind racing. He had to get out of there. He had to tell someone, anyone, what he had discovered. But as he reached the door, Madame Ojugo's voice stopped him in his tracks. "I warned you," she said, her tone dark and ominous. "Once you enter, there is no turning back." Obioma's heart raced as he flung the door open and ran out into the night, the darkness closing in around him as he fled. Behind him, Madame Ojugo's laughter echoed through the trees, sending shivers down his spine. Obioma burst into his small hut, drenched in sweat, his face pale with fear. His wife, Nena, was sitting by the hearth, stirring a pot of soup. She looked up, startled by his sudden entrance. The ladle slipped from her hand as she took in the sight of her husband, disheveled, his eyes wide with terror, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "Obioma, what happened? Where have you been?" Nena rushed to him, grabbing his arms and guiding him to sit on a low stool. She wiped his brow with the edge of her wrapper, her face full of concern. Obioma could barely catch his breath, his mind racing as he replayed the events of the night. The dark spirits, Madame Ojugo's confession, the smell of blood, it all haunted him. His throat felt dry, and his hands trembled, but he had to tell her. She needed to know the danger they were all in. "Nena," Obioma whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. "There's something I need to tell you, something terrible. But you have to promise you'll believe me." Nena's heart clenched as she saw the fear in her husband's eyes. She knelt in front of him, gripping his hands tightly. "Obioma, whatever it is, we'll face it together. Just tell me what happened." Taking a deep breath, Obioma began to recount the horrifying events of the night. He told her about Ike's disappearance, how Madame Ojugo had lured him to her house with promises of secrets, and how he had discovered that she was using human flesh in her meat business. He described the spirits that surrounded her and how he had barely escaped with his life. Nena's face drained of color as she listened to his words. She knew Obioma wasn't one to tell wild stories, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Still, she could see the terror in his eyes, the raw emotion in his voice. He wasn't lying. "Madame Ojugo," Nena whispered, her voice shaking. "But everyone trusts her. How could she do such a thing?" "I don't know," Obioma said, running a trembling hand through his hair. "But I swear, Nena, what I saw, it was real. I don't know how she's done it, but she's using dark magic, spirits that feed on human flesh. She's dangerous, and we have to stop her before more people disappear." Nena sat back on her heels, her mind racing. If what Obioma said was true, then the entire village was in danger. But how could they convince anyone else? Madame Ojugo was well respected, and her meat was beloved by many. Who would believe that she was a monster in disguise? "We have to tell the elders," Nena said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "They're the only ones who can rally the village and put a stop to this." Obioma nodded, his resolve hardening. We'll go at first light. The elders need to know the truth." That night, neither of them slept. The weight of what Obioma had seen hung heavily in the air, casting a dark shadow over their home. Nena kept her hands busy, moving from one task to the next, but her thoughts kept returning to Madame Ojugo's eerie smile, the way she had looked so harmless all these years. She prayed silently for protection, knowing that the fight ahead would be anything but easy. At the crack of dawn, Obioma and Nena made their way to the elders' council hut. The village was still waking up, the soft sounds of roosters crowing and women sweeping their compounds echoing in the morning air. Obioma felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest as they approached the hut. He wasn't sure how the elders would react to his story, but he knew he had to try. Inside the hut, the elders sat in a circle, discussing the day's business. Chief Ozoemena, the eldest among them, looked up as Obioma and Nena entered. His wise eyes studied the couple, noticing the tension in their expressions. "Obioma," Chief Ozoemena said, his voice deep and commanding, "what brings you here so early in the morning? Has something happened?" Obioma bowed his head respectfully before speaking. "Chief, there is something urgent I must tell you. Something that concerns the entire village. It's about Madame Ojugo." The mention of Madame Ojugo's name caused a ripple of murmurs among the elders. Chief Ozoemena raised a hand to silence them before turning his attention back to Obioma. "Speak, my son. What is it you have to say?" Obioma took a deep breath, glancing at Nena for reassurance. She gave him a small nod, and with that, he began to recount the events of the previous night once more. He told the elders everything: how Ike had disappeared, how Madame Ojugo had invited him to her home, and how she had revealed her dark secret. As he spoke, the elders listened intently, though their expressions grew more skeptical with each passing moment. When Obioma finished, the hut fell into an uneasy silence. The elders exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Chief Ozoemena was the first to speak. "These are grave accusations, Obioma. You understand that accusing a woman of such evil is not something we can take lightly. Are you certain of what you saw?" "I swear on my life," Obioma said, his voice firm. "I saw it with my own eyes. Madame Ojugo is not who she pretends to be. She's using dark magic to deceive us all, and people are dying because of it." One of the younger elders, Ikeen, scoffed. "And you expect us to believe that a woman who has lived among us for years, who has never caused harm, has suddenly turned into some sort of spirit worshipper? It sounds like a tale from the folktales." "I know it's hard to believe," Obioma said desperately, "but I wouldn't be here if it weren't true. Please, I beg you, we have to investigate before it's too late." Chief Ozoemena held up a hand to silence the bickering elders. His face was solemn as he regarded Obioma. "We will not ignore your claims, Obioma, but we must be cautious. If what you say is true, we cannot let such evil continue in our village. However, if you are mistaken, we cannot afford to ruin an innocent woman's reputation." The chief turned to the rest of the council. "We will go to Madame Ojugo's house this morning and conduct a search. If there is any truth to Obioma's claims, we will find it. And if there is not, we will put these fears to rest." The elders agreed, some more reluctantly than others, and preparations were quickly made. Obioma felt a sense of relief wash over him. At least they were taking action. But a small part of him couldn't shake the fear that Madame Ojugo might have already covered her tracks. As they set out for Madame Ojugo's house, Obioma walked beside Nena, his heart heavy with anticipation. The sun was rising higher now, casting long shadows across the village. The air was thick with tension, and though the men walked in silence, their thoughts were loud with doubt and fear. As they neared Madame Ojugo's house, Obioma couldn't help but glance at the dark trees surrounding the path. His heart raced as memories of the spirits swirled in his mind. This time he wouldn't be alone. The elders would confront her, and they would uncover the truth. One way or another, they would face Madame Ojugo and the evil she had brought into their village. The group of elders, led by Chief Ozoemena, approached Madame Ojugo's house with caution. The air around them seemed heavier as they drew closer, thick with an unsettling stillness that made the hair on the back of Obioma's neck prickle. He could feel the tension radiating from the men beside him, and despite their skepticism, they all seemed to sense that something was not right. Nena stayed close to Obioma, her hand lightly brushing his as if to reassure him that they were in this together. The house stood at the edge of the village, hidden partially by the dense trees of the forest. In the daylight, it appeared as unassuming as any other home, small with weathered wood and a sagging roof. But to Obioma, it held the weight of a nightmare. The group halted a few paces from the door. Chief Ozoemena turned to Obioma, his expression stern but not unkind. "You say this is where she revealed her dark secrets to you?" Obioma nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, Chief. Inside that house is where I saw the spirits, and where I heard her admit to using human flesh." The chief held Obioma's gaze for a moment longer before nodding. He stepped forward, raising his staff and striking the door 3 times. The sound echoed through the still air like a drumbeat. Moments later, the door creaked open, and Madame Ojugo appeared in the doorway. She smiled as she saw the group, her face calm and composed as always. "Chief Ozoemena," she said in her warm, familiar voice. "What brings you and the elders to my home so early?" Chief Ozoemena's face remained impassive, though the tension in the air was palpable. "Madame Ojugo, we have received disturbing accusations regarding your business. We are here to conduct a search of your home. It is in the interest of justice that we ensure there is no wrongdoing." Madame Ojugo's smile faltered slightly, but she did not show any signs of panic. "Accusations against me? That's absurd, Chief. I have always conducted my business openly and honestly. What could I possibly have done to warrant such a search?" The chief's voice remained steady, though his eyes were sharp as he watched her. "Obioma claims that you have been using human flesh in the meat you sell, and that you consort with dark spirits. We must search your home to see if there is any truth to these claims." Madame Ojugo's expression shifted from confusion to a soft chuckle. She stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Human flesh? Spirits? Oh, Obioma, what stories have you been telling? But please, Chief, you and your men are welcome to search my home. I have nothing to hide." Obioma's stomach twisted as he stepped inside with the others. The house looked much the same as it had the night before, simple with wooden furniture and a faint smell of cooking spices in the air. But now, in the light of day, it seemed more ordinary, less menacing. The shadows that had once flickered ominously were gone, and the spirits he had seen swirling in the corners of the room were nowhere to be found. The elders spread out, inspecting every nook and cranny of the small home. They lifted rugs, opened cupboards, and peered into every dark corner. Obioma watched them anxiously, his heart pounding in his chest. What if she had hidden the evidence? What if the spirits had vanished into the night, leaving no trace of their existence? Chief Ozoemena and a few of the other elders made their way to the back room, where Obioma had seen Madame Ojugo's dark rituals. He followed closely, his nerves on edge. As they opened the door to the back room, Obioma held his breath. Inside, the room looked entirely ordinary. There were no strange markings, no dark candles, no bloodstains on the floor. Instead, it appeared to be nothing more than a simple storage room, with sacks of grain piled in one corner, and a few shelves holding jars of spices and dried herbs. Chief Ozoemena inspected the room carefully, running his hand along the shelves and peering into the corners. After a few moments, he turned to Obioma, his expression unreadable. "Is this the room where you say you saw the spirits?" Obioma nodded, his voice tight. "Yes, Chief. This is where it happened. But it doesn't look the same now." One of the younger elders, Ikin, let out a scoffing laugh. "Of course it doesn't. This whole story has been nothing but a tale spun from fear and superstition. Madame Ojugo is a respected woman, not some witch conjuring spirits in the dark." Obioma's heart sank. He could see the doubt in the elders' faces. The absence of any clear evidence was making his story seem like a desperate fantasy. Madame Ojugo reappeared in the doorway, her expression one of polite amusement. "I understand that you have your duties, Chief, but surely you see now that there is no truth to these wild accusations. I am simply a meat seller, nothing more." Chief Ozoemena studied her carefully, then glanced back at Obioma. His voice was measured as he spoke. "Obioma, I have known you for many years, and I do not believe you would bring such a story to us lightly. But without evidence, we cannot accuse Madame Ojugo of these terrible deeds." Obioma felt a rush of frustration and desperation. "Chief, I know what I saw. I swear to you she is hiding something. The spirits, they were here. They've just vanished now. Please believe me." Chief Ozoemena sighed heavily. He looked around the room once more before turning back to Madame Ojugo. "We will leave you in peace, Madame Ojugo. I apologize for any distress this may have caused." Madame Ojugo bowed her head graciously. "There is no need to apologize, Chief. I understand that you are only doing your duty. But perhaps this will remind us all to be careful of the stories we choose to believe." Obioma's stomach churned as they left the house. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a grave mistake. As the elders began to disperse, Obioma and Nena lingered at the edge of the forest, watching Madame Ojugo's house in the distance. "She's hiding something," Obioma whispered, his voice thick with frustration. "I know it." Nena placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with worry. "I believe you, Obioma. But we can't force the elders to see what they don't want to see." Obioma nodded, though his mind raced with a sense of dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Madame Ojugo had managed to deceive the elders, but she wouldn't stop. And if the village didn't act soon, he feared there would be more disappearances, more deaths. As they walked back to their hut, Obioma glanced over his shoulder one last time, his eyes narrowing at the distant figure of Madame Ojugo standing in her doorway, watching them leave. Her smile had faded now, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. This was far from over. Obioma's worry gnawed at him, growing with each passing day. Despite the elders' dismissal, he couldn't shake the feeling that Madame Ojugo was still up to something sinister. He and Nena discussed their options late into the night, trying to come up with a plan to expose her before more harm could be done. One evening, as Obioma walked through the village, he overheard a conversation among some of the villagers. They were discussing Madame Ojugo's meat with excitement, praising its quality and affordability. The praise only deepened his concern. People were buying her meat without question, oblivious to the danger lurking beneath the surface. Determined to find proof, Obioma decided to investigate further. He needed to find something concrete to show the elders and the villagers. He and Nena agreed that he should try to get inside Madame Ojugo's house once more, hoping that a second search might reveal what they had missed before. Under the cover of darkness, Obioma crept toward Madame Ojugo's house. He moved silently, his heart pounding in his chest. The house was quiet, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of night birds. Obioma approached the back of the house, where he knew there was a small window. He pried it open carefully and slipped inside, moving cautiously through the dimly lit rooms. His eyes scanned every corner, looking for anything that might confirm his suspicions. In the back room where he had seen the spirits before, Obioma found something new, an ornate locked chest tucked away in a corner. The chest was intricately carved with symbols and patterns that made his skin crawl. He knew he had to open it. With trembling hands, Obioma found a small key hanging on a hook nearby and used it to unlock the chest. As the lid creaked open, a foul smell hit him, making him gag. Inside the chest were several packages wrapped in cloth. Obioma's heart raced as he unwrapped one of them, revealing a grotesque sight: human body parts preserved and packed carefully. Obioma's stomach churned as he realized the full extent of Madame Ojugo's horror. This was the evidence he needed. He quickly wrapped the packages back up, closed the chest, and made his way out of the house as quietly as he had come in. The next morning, Obioma and Nena went to Chief Ozoemena with the grim evidence. The chief, though initially skeptical, couldn't ignore the sight of the human remains. The other elders were summoned, and a meeting was called to address the findings. As the elders gathered, Obioma and Nena presented the evidence. Madame Ojugo was summoned once more, and the atmosphere was charged with tension. She arrived, her face a mask of composure, but it faltered when she saw the contents of the chest. The elders examined the evidence and turned to Madame Ojugo with grave expressions. "Madame Ojugo," Chief Ozoemena said, his voice stern, "the evidence we have found is beyond dispute. You are accused of using human flesh in your meat, and you have practiced dark magic to cover your tracks. You have betrayed the trust of our community and committed a grave evil." Madame Ojugo's demeanor changed from calm to defiant. "You may have found the evidence, but you will never truly understand my reasons. You were all blind to the truth, and now you have brought me to my end." The elders were swift in their judgment. Madame Ojugo was removed from the village. Her house was burned to the ground to cleanse it of her dark magic, and a new system of oversight was put in place to ensure the safety of the village. As the village recovered from the shock, Obioma and Nena returned to their daily lives, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what had nearly happened. The village slowly began to heal, and the trust in their community was renewed.